Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I briefly want to introduce two concepts by Edward Said, Filiation and Affiliation, which he discusses in his book, The Word, the Text, and the Critic. Now, the context of his discussion is that he is trying to suggest that texts are worldly and that they exist within the world, right? And I have a separate video on worldliness and you can watch it. But within that, he also brings up these two concepts. And what he's trying to tell us is that most of the times our reading of the texts or our associations as critics are either filiative or affiliative. So let's go by the texts. Anytime we read a literary text, right, it has its filiative structures, things that are part of it because of the culture, the normative culture that we imagine in which it exists. So we read Mansfield Park, we read it within its intertextuality with other novels of the same kind, with whatever was happening in the British culture at the same time, the question of authorial intention, all of that, and the Western sensibilities form part of the filiative structure of that text. Now, in order to make our reading more democratic, what he suggests is that we should look at the affiliative structures. And what does that mean? That go beyond what might be considered natural about a novel, what might be its natural resources, natural origins, and go elsewhere, right? The world itself, the politics of it, colonialism, what knowledge can we bring to bear upon it from outside the Eurocentric world. That would be an affiliative mode of reading a novel or a literary text. Now, what he suggests then is that in colonialism, as we go through the colonial educational system, internalize the system of values that is taught through that, this filiative structure of looking at a novel or a short story or a poem gets transferred culturally to the colonial subjects, right, to the colonized subjects. And then they take that and continue reading literature and literary texts from that point of view, with that filiative structure. And you can see the examples of it in India, Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria, where literature is taught and people are expected to read a British novel like as if they are British themselves, right? Or internalize those British sensibilities. And what he suggests is that the role of the critic, especially the post-colonial critic, is to develop affiliations with their own culture, with knowledges that not be part of the dominant mainstream, and then bring that to bear upon the reading of the text. But what he also suggests is that most of the times, even when post-colonial societies become free and develop different affiliations, those filiative structures of politics and culture, they still remain there. They remain intact and they keep perpetuating themselves. And so part of the role of the critic is to point to those filiative structures. Now, filial, of course, comes from family, right? So a filial structure would be a structure which is inherent through culture, not racially or by birth, but through a dominant culture, right? And an affiliative structure is when you dispense with the affiliative structure and go and develop more autonomous and different modes of thinking. So this is what he talks about in terms of the texts. But he's also trying to theorize in this book the role of the critic. And when he goes in discussing that, what he points out to is that most critics are usually inscribed within a filiative structure. And that is, they have certain assumptions that they might have been taught, that they have internalized, and then they continue teaching that. But in the process of their education or their growth or their learning, they also develop affiliative structures, things that they might have not learned in their institution, things that are new, that they've incorporated, right? And when that happens, then the critics start reading the text differently, right? For example, I could have been trained as a British literature scholar. My affiliative structure would have been that of a British traditional scholar, and then I take a course on post-colonial studies, African American studies, Latinx studies, and suddenly I have now built new affiliative structures which force me to rethink my assumptions and my ways of reading. And it is that affiliative structure, forcing the affiliative belief system, cultural and others, to open up, is what he considers worthy of our attention, right? Now, another thing that he points out in the same book is that what ends up happening is we bring our cultural baggage and heritage and affiliative structure to the academy. That is what enables us to read a situation or a text. But in the process of our training, we develop affiliations, like literal affiliations with other scholars, but scholastically and philosophically, we develop affiliative structures with different bodies of texts and knowledges that enables us to develop, more expensive identities. But a strange thing happens, and that is, when we become scholars in our own right, those affiliative structures then take on the shape of affiliative structures, because we start defending them and we maintain the borders of our own thought. So a truly critical and perceptive critic then would constantly also look at his or her own affiliative belief system, but also the affiliative belief system, and see if his or her positions have become hardened and they've started believing what they had learned or what they had incorporated in their thought process. They have started believing it to be natural, right? So overall, just this cursory discussion of Said's concepts of filiation and affiliation, what we can take away from it as scholars, students, literature students, is that the best practice in keeping ourselves open to new knowledges and to perform what he calls a worldly or contrapuntal reading, I also have a video on that, is to constantly question our affiliations, scholarly, political, cultural, and the affiliative structures of a text that we are reading, and see if we can bring something from outside, something affiliated with it, but not an integral part of it. And then constantly question whether or not our own view of the world or view of reading text or handling the text has become a hard affiliative structure. And if it has, then of course as critics and scholars, and of course teachers, our job is to question that, to figure out what is it which makes my thought into a hardened affiliative structure, right? And then try to constantly change that. Now, if we develop this mode of thinking, imagine the possibilities. First of all, it will constantly make us self-critical of our own hard stances. It will make us question our own hard stances about culture, about literary texts, but it will also enable us to constantly keep looking for new knowledges, new modes of reading, and maybe more egalitarian mode of reading. Chances are, if you are aware of filiative and affiliative modes of thinking and what is at stake in them, you will never give your uncritical loyalty to one system of thought, one system of aesthetics, or one modes of reading a text or writing about it or having an opinion about it. And if you can do that, or if I can do that, right, then I would have become a sort of a critic and a scholar who's open to change, who's willing to look beyond the conventional affiliative structures of a text, and who's willing to write from a different perspective and bring to bear upon a novel knowledge that otherwise have not been considered a part of the reading practice of a novel. Now, Said gives a really good example of that in one of his other books, Culture and Imperialism, where he reads Mansfield Park, right? Usually, traditionally, Mansfield Park is read within the context of the British novel and British novelistic tradition, right? And he brings the affiliative knowledge of the colonies by suggesting, okay, look at these people's privilege. Yeah, they have problems and all that, but their privilege is underwritten by Caribbean slavery, by the plantation system in the Caribbean. So let's bring that to bear upon this story and then point out what is it that these novelists already take for granted, that it's okay for the colonies to underwrite the rising middle class and their privilege. That is one good example of doing that. So to conclude, filiative structures about the text are the ones that are the conventional assumptions about the text, its author, its milieu, its context. Affiliative structures about a text are the ones that exist outside the text, may come from another culture, and can expand the meanings of a text. Filiative structures for a critic or a scholar are the structures, modes of thought, ideas that he or she has internalized through training, through what could be considered an academic family. And then affiliative structures are the ones that he or she would develop in the process of exchanging views with others. One is almost familial, the other is social, right? But affiliative always has a danger of becoming affiliative structure. So keep this in mind. I hope this is useful to you, and you can use this in your studies. I do highly recommend the book, The World, the Text, the Critic. I think it is one of the most important Said books, and we all should at least read it once. That's all. Thank you so much. Please take care. I will be back now with something else of your interest. Until then, take care, stay safe, and I will now see you next time. Peace and love.